Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this rescheduled Brennan Center for Justice event. I think it's going to be really compelling, really interesting, and really relevant. I am Michael Waldman. I'm president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We're delighted to have you and these really wonderful speakers with us today. I do want to start by mentioning something that I know is on all of our minds and in all of our hearts, which is everybody on this call, every one of us is thinking about what the murders, the massacre in Buffalo, and sending our thoughts, our prayers, our passion, and our anger in response to that. We all know that this was a political crime, that it was motivated by white supremacy and conspiracy theories of the Great Replacement peddled by major media companies and major politicians. And we can't turn away from that. And the moment is not too soon to say that. And we know that it was made possible by the gun laws of this country. We have now 400 million guns in the United States, and which allow an 18-year-old to dress up in weapons of war, putting the lie to the idea that a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun. There was a hero security guard, as we all know, who actually shot the murderer, but he was wearing body armor and was able to kill the guard. We're all thinking about this. We need to use this as a moment all together to come together as a country. We note that the councilwoman, who you'll meet in a few minutes, had a tragedy in her own district, which caused us to reschedule this event when we were originally going to be doing it because of the shootings, thank goodness, not fatal, in the subways in Sunset Park. We have to do better as a country. We have to stand together. We have to stand together as a beloved community. We have to stand together with each other. And we have to stand together for the country we want to be, for a democracy that represents everybody and a country where everybody can flourish. And in a lot of ways, that is really what this event today is about. One of the ways that could lead us toward that path. Before we get started, I want to share a few housekeeping matters. First of all, we will leave time for questions at the end of this discussion. And if you have a question, please, that you would like to ask, feel free to add them via the chats in YouTube or in Facebook. Second, civility is important to all of us at the Brennan Center. And it's a way of modeling the way we ought to live our democracy. If you post rude or intemperate language in our message streams on YouTube and Facebook, you will be removed from the conversation. And finally, we do provide closed captioning. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, as I said, I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We are a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work, as we see it, to strengthen, to reform, to defend the systems of democracy and justice in our country at an urgent moment of crisis. We're very appreciative to our partners in producing this event, NYU's John Bradamus Center, which advocates for civil debate in politics and public policy. And of course, was started by and named after former Congressman John Bradamus, who was the president of NYU. Now, about today's program, one of the reasons I'm so excited about this conversation is we all work and we all think about in different ways how to make our democracy work. We know there are attacks on voting. There are efforts to make it so people can't vote. There are efforts to expand voting. We know that in 2020, despite the pandemic and despite voter suppression and lies, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900. That was something of a civic miracle. A part of what made that possible in this extraordinary circumstance of a pandemic were changes in how people voted and how people registered. And it showed that there was, in some respects, a pent-up hunger for participation. But it's also the case that even though it was a record for the United States, many other countries would regard it as a distressingly low participation number. We all know that throughout American history, and especially over the last 120 years or so, there have been obstacles and other social and cultural factors that have meant we have had a far, far lower participation rate, a far lower voting rate than other similarly situated democracies. And one of the ideas that is compelling, interesting, innovative, challenging, and controversial is what we'll be hearing about today, the idea of universal voting, of having voting be a requirement. And a lot of people, when they first hear that, their first reaction is to be surprised, to almost recoil. And then they think, well, we have other things that are mandatory. We have to pay our taxes. We have to serve on juries. There's selective service. This, too, is a civic obligation. There's a compelling rationale. Many other countries do it, on the one hand. On the other hand, there is, at the very least, such a strong libertarian streak in our country, a country where tens of millions of people refuse to take a vaccine that will save their lives out of stubborn independence, may have cultural obstacles to something like what we're talking about today. There are arguments on all sides. It is really important, as we look at the democracy we want to build, that we expand the notion of what is possible. Otherwise, we will be engaged in trench warfare forever. And this is a really, really compelling, almost thought experiment on what that would mean. And we're really, really fortunate to have the two authors of this book here to talk to us about it. You probably know them. E.J. Dionne is a columnist for the Washington Post, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, the author of numerous books on American government, on American politics, and on religion, and one of the most wise commentators on television and in print on our politics and what the challenges are. And Miles Rapo is a longtime leader in the fight for a stronger democracy. He was the Secretary of State of Connecticut. We all know how important those jobs are these days. I don't think he's ever denied an election the way some of the folks running for office are this time. But Miles was the Secretary of State of Connecticut. He was the leader of the organization Demos and the president of Common Cause, and he is now at the Kennedy School. And without further ado, I want to introduce our tremendous moderator for this event and this evening, Alexa Avilés. She's a member of the New York City Council, a very vibrant and vital institution, and she is an exciting new voice in this. She is the council member for District 38 for Sunset Park. She's the chair of the Public Housing Committee in the council. And before tossing her hat in the ring and joining the political fray, she spent almost 3 decades in the not-for-profit and philanthropic fields. She's given a lifetime of service. We're very grateful to you for helping us think through these issues and for joining us today. Alexa, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm so excited to be here and to be part of this conversation. And before I jump in, absolutely want to extend my prayers and best wishes to everyone that was impacted in Buffalo, across the country, who face gun violence every single day. We are working hard to really, we have a lot of work to do. So as I jump in, just want to reiterate some things that Michael mentioned at the top in his comments, right? The United States saw record voter turnout in 2020, in the 2020 presidential election, a full 13% jump from the 2016 election. And yet we are lagging behind so many other democracies like Belgium and Sweden, Australia, Uruguay, South Korea. Are we missing an opportunity to just skip over all the arguments over voting rights? What about the process? What about a process where every citizen not only has the right to vote, but a requirement to do so? Considering that 26 countries already require participation in their elections, we don't have to blaze our own path here. So this new book, 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting Rights, argues that the United States should follow in the footsteps of these democracies, not just by guaranteeing the right to vote, but requiring that everyone exercise that right. So, joining me now to talk about the possibility are the authors E.J. Dionne is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and you heard a little bit more about his background from Michael. And he's also a columnist for the Washington Post. And Miles Rapo is a senior practice fellow in American democracy at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. So welcome, E.J. Dionne and Miles. So good to see you.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here. Alexa, delightful to be with you. We've been friends for a long time. This is another episode here.
Absolutely. And so such an exciting topic to talk about. And honored to be here with such trailblazers. So why don't we start with EJ? EJ, can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book? And why do you think this idea is a game changer for the voting rights conversation at this time?
Well, thank you so much for doing this, Councilwoman. It's great to be with you. And we felt a lot of solidarity with the people in your district when the terrible incident happened on the subway. And thank you, Michael, for expressing our solidarity with the people of Buffalo and the families of those killed. And it would be good if we could join our thoughts and prayers with action on guns and against white supremacy. I just want to say a couple of thank yous as well. One is to the Brennan Center. The work of the Brennan Center is extraordinary. It was very important to us indeed, when my research assistant was helping us do fact checking, we constantly ran into updates of new information from the Brennan Center. So many people in the country rely on the Brennan Center on issues like voting rights, and also on behalf of sane action on guns, about which Michael has written so well. And I also want to thank my friend and partner in this project, Miles Rapo. I always say of Miles that Miles has so much energy that if Europe could simply tap Miles, it would never have to import another drop of oil or gas. And I'm really grateful, and we'll get to that Miles has organized the 100% Democracy Initiative to fight for this idea. I came to this in the first instance because I've spent a lot of time in Australia over the years and got to know a lot of people on all sides of Australian politics. And I ran across their system and saw that the system worked very well as an invitation for the entire country to participate in the process of building democracy. I like to think of what's happened to our electoral system in terms of a fancy dinner party. You know those fancy dinner parties where there is an A list and a B list and a C list, and you really want the A list there, and then when they don't come, then the people organizing the dinner party turn to the B or the C list. Our elections really have become like that. We have an A list of likely voters, people who are registered and vote all the time, and they are showered with attention by the candidates, by the political consultants. They are asked to come into the system, but also regular voters for the other side are often showered with very negative and nasty information about their side's candidate in an effort to discourage them from voting. And of course, we are also seeing efforts to suppress votes from that base. People on the B list and the C list are almost never asked to join. They are largely ignored by our electoral process. And that has some very negative effects. We know that people do things when they are asked and invited to do them. And so we reinforce our turnout problems by never inviting them in. The Australian system, about which we model a lot of our proposal after, and which we can talk about in more detail, works because it has created a different culture of democracy. Because every Australian knows that he and she are expected to be part of the decision-making process in the country. This leads to an election day that is, as a voter we quote in the book, election day that's like a party. In polling places all over the country, you don't have the dreary 6-hour wait that some voters confront under our system. You have community groups setting up stands, offering people great food to eat, including most famously what are called democracy sausages, because they are there to raise money for school and civil society organizations. But everybody knows that everybody else is going to be there. That changes how candidates behave, and it changes how voters behave. And finally, we believe, Miles and I, that the best way to defend voting as a right is to assert a universal civic obligation to vote. Because doing that will require the entire electoral system to make it as easy as possible for people to do their civic duty. We don't put up roadblocks when we call people to jury service. We shouldn't put up roadblocks when we call people to vote. And we think our system could create a different spirit in our democracy and a different kind of election campaign.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. How about for you, Miles? You've been involved in the voting rights community for a long time, and certainly election issues. What made you to decide to embrace this idea of universal voting?
Well, first, let me say thanks to you, Alexa, for being part of this tonight. It's really delightful to see you. And I want to echo two comments that EJ made. First is that returning the compliment to EJ, he has been an incredible partner for this work. I mean, he's knowledgeable. He's an incredible voice for good politics in the country, and also a great writer, and also just a really, really good partner and friend to have. So thank you. And I also want to say to the Brennan Center, I've been a partner of the Brennan Center for many, many years. We were neighbors when I was president of Demos. We worked on many, many of the same issues. And I would say with 99, maybe even 100% agreement on what needs to be done. So I find the Brennan Center's work inspiring, reliable, and out in front on so many issues. So Michael, thank you for everything that you and your colleagues at Brennan have done. So taking the point, though, of how long I have worked on these issues, I went back and thought about it a little bit. And if you take the time that I spent in the Connecticut legislature as Secretary of the State, as president of Demos and Common Cause, and now for 5 years at the Kennedy School, I've really been working on these issues for about 40 years. And, I believe in all of the reforms that we have worked on. Same-day registration was something that Demos and I worked on passionately for a long time. Restoration of voting rights for people who have been incarcerated, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, expanded mail-in voting, expanded early voting, automatic voter registration where people who have contact with the DMV or other government agencies get registered. And I think all of those things have worked to some degree. They have moved the needle. They moved the needle enough so that we have a vicious counterattack on voting rights coming from people who want to enshrine white minority rule by any means necessary. But when I really looked at it, and both you and Michael used the statistic about the 2020 election, I'll throw in the 2018 election was the highest midterm election turnout, probably forever, and it was at 50.3%. So I'm glad we set records in 2018 and 2020, but it's nothing to write home about. So I started to say, after all this time, what could be a real game changer? What could really move the needle? And then I actually read the article that E.J. Dionne wrote for the Brookings Institution with his colleague, William Galston. And I was gobsmacked, to use a word that people don't use very much anymore. But it was amazing to me that, here in Australia for 100 years and in 25 other democratic countries under Freedom House's definition, people are required to vote as a matter of civic duty. And here I'd been working for 40 years and never, not once, ever been in a conversation about this. So I decided, look, this is important. This is potentially game changing. This is something that is worth really, really looking into. So I was fortunate that EJ was willing to co-chair a working group that was a joint project of the Brookings Institution and the Ash Center. And then very fortunate that Diane Wachtel, who was the executive director of the New Press, which is a wonderful, splendid, nonpartisan and nonprofit press publisher, really wanted this book to be written. And so we wrote it. And our goal is to put this idea into the public debate in a serious way, which it has not been done forever, really forever in this country. Yes, as Michael said, people kind of, recoil a little bit at first, or it's certainly brand new to them. But we think there's some very, very compelling logic, both from the service, from people's requirement to serve on juries, which we do because we want juries to reflect the full population of the country. And I think the same thing goes for voting. So I've decided that this is really something that's worth putting my full effort into, and I plan to do that going forward.
We are so thankful for that. Birthing the first multiracial democracy is going to require us to think outside the box, just the same way that you are doing here with this book and all this incredible work. So thank you, Miles. And so EJ, going back to you, you mentioned Australia. You mentioned the fact that this system has been around for 100 years. Can you tell us a little bit about how would universal voting work here in our context? And, what advantages do you think it would bring?
Right. Well, thank you very much. And we draw we make a very concrete proposal, which we would like to be picked up on at the federal and level, but also this will probably start in the states and localities. And our proposal is really rooted in what the Australians do, with a couple of very particular American tweaks to it. I'll describe the Australian system as a way of describing ours. In Australia, the government makes major efforts to make sure everyone is registered to vote, and they make it easy to register to vote. One of my research assistants was looking at the Australian elections website and came into my office all excited and said, Australia makes it really easy for people to register and vote. Why don't we do that? And indeed, why don't we do that? Australia registers about 96% of its citizens, and because of this system, 90% of them vote that cast ballots. In Australia, if you don't vote, you get a little notice from the government, and it says, could you tell us why you didn't vote? If an Australian citizen gives any sort of good reason why they didn't vote, the fine is waived. There is no fine, with the result that only about 13% of non-voters, which is about 1% of all voters, ever has to pay a fine. The fine is small. It's $20 Australian, which is about $15 American. The result of this, what Australia also does, is it makes it extraordinarily easy for people to vote. You can vote in any polling place in your state. They do have early mail voting, which is on the rise in Australia as it is here. Elections are on a Saturday, which means a lot of people have the day off. We don't particularly propose a Saturday, but we do think Election Day should be a national holiday. And again, we think that what follows from the requirement is an effort that, like the one made in Australia, to make voting easy. Now, we do a couple of tweaks to this in deference to some of America's particular libertarian traditions. If you have a deep objection to participating in politics at all, whether for religious or other reasons, we provide for a conscientious objector status that you could apply for and not be subject to this rule. We also make clear that if you can't pay the $20 fine, you could fulfill your obligation with an hour of community service. But we also were very concerned about what has come to be known as the Ferguson problem of poor people, particularly Black Americans, being piled high with fines that are increased with interest in penalties that become criminalized. And so we are very clear that this is not a criminal penalty. No criminal penalties are attached to this. There are no interest in or penalties, so it's a flat $20. And we think the result of this would be in the United States, as it is in Australia, in creating this new spirit. And I appreciate, Councilwoman, what you and Michael said about why we think it's time to think anew. Because I think that the voting rights community necessarily has been playing a lot of defense. And there was great progress made in 2000 And now there's pulling back. And we're actually, as the Brennan Center has shown, becoming two nations when it comes to democracy. 25 states have actually further expanded options to vote since 2020, but 19 states are pulling back, sometimes really sharply, as in states like Florida and Texas. And we think it's time to call the question, the fundamental question, not just argue about should it be 10 or 20 days of early voting, how many Sundays, and so on, but to really ask people, do they want an inclusive democracy or not? Do they want something closer to 100% democracy, or do they really want to continue to exclude people from voting? And I just want to close with one of my favorite, and Miles likes it too, Abraham Lincoln, something Abraham Lincoln said long ago that we think really does apply to our time. Lincoln said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." And we think this idea could begin a very different kind of debate. And we'd call the question about what we really think of democracy.
That's so great. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that quote. It makes me so excited. Miles, I guess turning to you, I guess in the book, we talk a lot about gateway reforms to expanding voting rights locally and at the state level. As you know, New York City passed municipal voting to expand voting rights for in municipal elections for folks with permanent residency, which was a major campaign win. Can you give us other examples of other important gateway reforms that you looked at in the book?
Sure, and I mentioned a few of them earlier, but what we have seen, other than the kind of mean-spirited resistance to voting and the desire to exclude people from the process, but in many states and some cities, what we have seen is real expansion of the opportunities for people to register and vote. When we started working on same-day registration at Demos, there were 6 states that did same-day registration, and now there are 23 states that have it. Early voting, which was very rare, 20 years ago, is now offered in 40 states around the country, and online registration, which of course technologically was not available, is also in 40 states. You have states that are using vastly more mail-in voting than they did, and all these are things that are, both make it they're good in and of themselves, but they also make it imaginable to have a system where everyone is voting and everyone sees it and is required to do it as a matter of civic duty. I find, Alexa, the jury duty analogy very, very powerful, because the reason that we have compulsory service on juries is because we want the questions of guilt and innocence and of appropriate punishment for people when they have transgressed to be done by a fully reflective pool of people who are, represent the fullness of our country. And I think the exact same thing goes for voting. What we want, or we should certainly want, is that the decisions about how we govern ourselves, what laws we live under, and who makes those laws should be made by everyone, not a very partially and tilted electorate, which is what we have now. So our hope is that, so ranked choice voting is another, which I know New York City has gone to, where these are reforms that begin at the local level or at the state level. In Justice Brandeis's terms, they are laboratories of democracy. And our hope is that we can stimulate enough discussion, among policy people, among organizations, among groups like the Brennan Center, like Demos, like Common Cause, to support this. Then I think we're really going to be able to start seeing actual legislative action in it, probably in 2023 and beyond.
Alexa, could I just make one quick point off that?
Sure.
One of the things that we've talked about a lot and have run into is in commentary from people on the idea is when you think about the big holes in our electorate, the people who are really underrepresented, One of the groups we need to pay attention to are young people, because our system is really, really hard on the participation of young people. Young people move around a lot more than older people do. Our system is relatively good if you live in the same place for a long time and you have the same address and the same registration, as long as people aren't trying to suppress your vote actively. Whereas young people often discover, depending on the jurisdiction, if they don't have election day registration, that by the time they're focused on the campaign, the way other citizens are, registration is already closed off to them. And you see this in the census numbers on turnout in 2020. Youth turnout was way up, but it was still 54% compared to 74.5% of people over 65. We think a system like this that would make it much easier to register to vote, including, as I say, I think election day registration, is a way for young people who are very frustrated by the political system, particularly it's ignoring issues such as climate change or not doing enough about those issues. We think this idea would be an important way to empower young people and also working class people who are also underrepresented in the electorate. And it's a way to block barriers to participation from Black Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and others.
Absolutely. My experience on the ground, explaining the myriad of dates and forms and complications underscores exactly what you're saying. And when we've been able to make it easier, like pre-registration for 6 and 17-year-olds, and a clear process.
That's on our list.
And an easy form, right? Folks want to. And when we are an immigrant community, my district is, I have folks from Peru and from other countries. Folks are, quite frankly, really surprised that it is not part of our civic duty. It's not kind of an expectation of engagement here, and are really eager to do that. So we are so excited to continue this conversation. And we have a flow of incoming questions that we are going to be getting to from the audience very shortly. So I
hope our producer doesn't mind. The sunlight in this room is wonderful, except for Zoom calls, and I was blinded by the light there. So I've just moved around. I hope I'm okay.
I think now we're probably seeing a little too much glare.
Yeah, but I'm trying to take care of the glare. I will work on that while we go to the questions.
I call it not. I don't call it glare. I call it brilliance coming off of you.
Yes, you're glowing.
Yeah, there we go.
This is magic in action.
Friend.
Yeah, magic in action. This is the brilliance in the room that we're all experiencing here. So, I generally don't like to spend time on the opposition and giving air, but there are probably some real questions around some of the kind of objections that you surfaced in the book. Could we go through a few of those and just answer a few of them, and then we can go into a Q&A? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I think that's good. And in fact, we appreciate that because we know that there are a lot of doubts about this system. So we welcome debate. We even welcome people writing articles opposed to the idea because we want this idea to be debated publicly. So God bless even the people who want to push back on us, because that's the way you get a reform through, is to answer those kinds of.
Absolutely. It is through dialogue.
There was a critique piece in the New York Post just yesterday in preparation for tonight's event.
Well, there you go. So this is the dynamic element here in action. So why don't we start with, would universal voting just help Democrats?
Oh, that's a really important question that we get a lot. And we make the argument in the book, and there's been evidence since we wrote the book for the idea that no, that's not the case. And in fact, I know some Republicans who quietly support this. I'm trying to get them to come out publicly because they like the idea of a larger electorate, because they think it will help them save their party from extremism, because a larger electorate will include more people who are not terribly ideological. But if we use a couple of examples in the book, one example in the book, which is a lot of people ask themselves, how did Joe Biden win in 2020 by 7 million votes, and yet Democrats lost seats, Republicans picked up seats in the House of Representatives? And the answer is because of all the changes we made in election laws, and because obviously the election engaged a lot of people. People wanted to come out and vote either for or against Trump. There was this massive turnout increase, including in Republican areas where, and there were many more of the Republican voters in 2020 than in 2018. But probably the most striking example was in Virginia in 2021. Democrats, when they controlled the state, made a whole lot of changes that made it easier to vote. And in 2021, there was extraordinary turnout in the governor's race in Virginia, and Republicans won all three statewide offices on a very high turnout. It's worth noting that this idea was first proposed 100 years ago in Australia by the conservative side of politics. They were worried about the power of organized labor and that unions would help the Labor Party win elections forever. The Labor Party looked at this idea and said, no, we think we can do just fine under this system. And Australia's had regular alteration of government between center left and center right all through the history of having this system. You currently, there's an election coming up next weekend, where the conservatives are in power, may lose power to Labor. But this is we are not trying to lock in a result for anybody. We are trying to invite everybody to participate.
Great. How about Miles? Some people would say, obviously, that voting rights are clearly under attack. And isn't this pie in the sky thinking? What would be your answer to that?
Well, we are kind of by our nature optimists and trying to look at at a potential future. But in answer to what you're saying, and Michael raised it before as well, we do have a situation that's really dire where voting rights are under attack. There is a faction. By the way, I do want to say it's not all Republicans. I know of a number of Republican secretaries of state and other Republican election officials who worked really hard in 2020 to make sure that the election was fair and that people could vote. But within the Republican Party is a faction that is determined to roll back voting rights and to get white minority rule by any means necessary. So we have a very, very powerful defensive fight to wage, and it has to be done in the courts. And I thank the Brennan Center for a lot of the work that they have done in kind of voting rights legislation, voting rights litigation. It has to be done in legislatures to really push back and try to push back on some of those laws. It has to be done in the streets by demonstrations and making sure that that voices are raised in support of voting rights. And frankly, it has to be done by the Justice Department because some of this stuff is clearly illegal. So, yes, we are not naive in the sense of we know that there is a big fight to protect what we have. But at the same time, there's an old song that goes, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. We also want to put this idea out as a North Star to say, and EJ said it very eloquently just a little while ago, to call the question about, do we want a democracy that is fully participatory, fully inclusive, fully multiracial, or do we not? And I believe that the majority of people in this country do want that. And so we're not on completely la la land ground here. We are going to have opposition. We are going to have to make the case. We will find places. We're not going to persuade everybody. But we will find places where people are willing to take up this challenge and willing to look ahead to the future. So we're optimists, certainly of the spirit, but realists in terms of what we see around us. So we have that fight to wage, but we want to keep thinking and keep dreaming, I guess is the right word, of what we could have if we put our hearts and minds to it.
That's right. And I would add that the book also has some very concrete, look at different laws and possibilities of implementation and some very concrete actions that we could all take. So I guess with that, we'll segue into the amazing audience questions that have come in since we are about that time. So I guess we'll start with the first question. In this system, would who you have voted for still be anonymous?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I'm glad that question was asked, and I often end with this, but I'll do it now. We think of the secret ballot as something we have always had. In fact, our elections for a good part of our history did not use secret ballots. People cast their ballots in the open. They were printed by political parties or partisan newspapers. There's a great account in the history, in the biographies and histories of Abraham Lincoln, of his going with a Republican ballot and out of humility scratching off his own electors on the ballot. Imagine a candidate doing that today, but everybody knew he was putting a Republican ballot in the box. Lo and behold, our friends in Australia actually pioneered the secret ballot, and it spread around Australia and became the national practice. And a lot of Americans, again, looked to Australia and said, gee, that's a good idea. And there was a fierce fight over it. A lot of people didn't like the idea of the secret ballot. Political machines didn't like it because if they paid somebody a few dollars to vote, they couldn't guarantee with the secret ballot that the person did what they were paid for. And it took about 30 years for the secret ballot to become the common practice in the United States. Jill Lepore, the great historian, has a great piece we footnote in our book about this. And so our view is the United States has always been quite good at picking up good ideas from other people. And we export them too, but we're smart about learning from others. We learned about Australia on the secret ballot. We think that something we now look at the secret ballot and say, well, didn't we always do it this way? How could anybody do it differently? We hope someday people will look at the system that we propose and say, well, why didn't we do that all along?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Miles, let's ask the next question for you. And thank you to the incredible audience for all these great questions. Would a fine for not voting run up against the poll tax prohibition?
No, we don't think so at all. We had a terrific legal team that wrote a chapter on all of the constitutional questions that might come up in regard to this. There's no question that if a state were to adopt universal voting, there would be lawsuits galore, and it would have to, stand the test of legality and constitutionality. So we think, on the one hand, that this is not compelled speech, which has been held by many, many courts to be something that you can't do, because you would have a none of the above option, because if you just pass in a blank ballot, that would be okay. So you're not compelled under the system that we're recommending to vote for any particular candidate. By the same token, it is not, we're not charging people to vote. So the poll tax, I think, is not a correct analogy. We do, obviously for parking tickets and for other things, we do fine people if there is a legal obligation to do something. So it is very clear that, that states and municipalities could do this, and we don't think it would do this. And let me just segue quickly to another question that I see in the list, and that is, could we do this without a constitutional amendment? And the answer is absolutely yes. Congress could enact this at the federal level for all federal elections. In fact, Congressman John Larson, who is the congressman from Connecticut, actually from my own district, has put in a bill called the Civic Duty to Vote Act, based on having read the book and thinking that this is a really good idea. So it could be done on the federal level, but it's also very clear that state legislatures, under the powers to regulate the hours and procedures of elections, could do this for state elections and congressional elections as well. Municipalities, I think, could actually do this for local elections, although they might need permission or support from the state in certain places. So that's a long answer to a short question, but the answer is no, we would not need a constitutional amendment, and we think this is very, very much within the constitutional parameters.
Great, thank you so much. And I was going to ask you that question next, so you beat me to it. In terms of, I guess you did talk a little bit earlier, EJ, about ensuring that this didn't become a tax on poor people and poor communities the way other fines and fees have become. Could you describe any of the provisions that you've looked at in that regard? You did mention that Australia, it's a very nominal fee. Have you developed any proposals in that regard in terms of the fee?
Well, our main proposals on the fee, and we're open to other avenues, and there's one I'm going to suggest in a second. But we, by not criminalizing it and by not having penalties or interest, we think, and by offering the hour of community service in place of paying the fine, we think we cover it. It's also, I mean, $20 can mean a lot to a very poor family. We get that, but that we would have a lid on it there. But we also in the book talk about positive incentives to vote. And Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, among other people, but she is, I think, at the moment most associated with it, has talked about creating a refundable tax credit for people who register to vote. It's not a tax credit for voting because our lawyers, we looked at incentives in our book, and our legal team said that the actually giving a tax credit for voting might run afoul of laws against vote buying. But a tax credit for registration, we think, would survive that. So imagine if you had, say, a $50 tax credit if you registered, and the system made it as easy as possible to register. The government helped by registering people wherever it could. Then for the person who got the $20 fine, they would have already gotten a $50 or $100 tax credit for registration. So they're actually paying the fine out of money that they've already gotten for registering. So we think there are a variety of ways of doing this. But again, we think our main response to this is to make sure it does not become criminal or grow into some absurd amount, which has happened to a lot of fees and penalties in our country.
Alexa, let me add just one small point to what EJ just said, and that is the other issue that can come up is the question of, well, what if people vote inadvertently, illegally, because they're getting all of the public information that says you must vote, you're required to vote, and either they're not a citizen, and it's in a state election as opposed to a New York City election, or they have lost their voting rights because of a felony conviction and have not yet had them regained. We make it very clear that any legislation that we would support and encourage would make it very clear that inadvertent violations of any of the vote here would not be subject to any of the fines or penalties, and we think that administratively that can be done.
Thank you for that. Another audience question is, how can universal voting be nonpartisan?
Well, we think it's in its essence nonpartisan. As I said earlier, we think Republicans can do just fine with a full electorate. Indeed, I don't think the Republican Party does itself a favor whenever it says, as Donald Trump said outright in the 2020 election, if more people vote, we lose. I don't think that's automatic by any means, as we've seen in Virginia, in those other congressional districts. In those congressional districts, the Republicans won in 2020. And there's a lot of dynamism in the electorate. This system would help working class people, would encourage voting among working class people, a lot of whom do vote Republican. And we think the idea of an inclusive democracy is very Lincoln Republican. And one of the things we forget, I just want to close on this, is we have a Voting Rights Act in part because an awful Republicans in Congress, a Voting Rights Act back in 1965. I think of somebody like Jacob Javits in New York, Congressman Bill McCullough, who was from John Boehner's district, who was not a liberal Republican, but he believed in civil rights and voting rights. So we think inclusion was a very Republican idea for a very long time, and we'd like to see it become a Republican idea again.
Fantastic. So we have about 5 more minutes to get through some other questions, and then we'll go into our close. But in terms of how would this impact voter fraud?
Well, it's interesting. The issue of voter fraud, or the canard of voter fraud, has been used to deny people the right to vote for a very long time. All of the people who have studied this, and I give the Brennan Center, again, a lot of credit for being in the forefront of this, have clearly demonstrated that the voter fraud in the sense of people voting as if they were another person or organizing people to vote who are not eligible, it's an absolutely minuscule, virtually non-existent problem. What it is a convenient foil for people who want to make it more difficult for new citizens to vote, for African-American communities to vote, for poor people to vote, for young people to vote. And so, I don't think this would be an invitation to fraud, because I don't think that the system that we have does it. But we would say this, which is that one thing I hope that we will encourage by having the conversation about universal voting is a much more focused attention on competent, properly funded, nonpartisan election administration. The United States is alone in having partisan election officials, and I was one, so I know, oversee their own elections or their party's fortunes. In Australia, one of the reasons it works is they have a really good national Australian election commission, which is properly funded, has really, really good staff, and has the authority to make sure that the laws that are on the books in regard to elections are enforced. So if we could do, in order to have universal voting succeed, but really in order to have our democracy succeed, we need a much stronger, more centralized election administration. So that's one thing I think we can do to make sure. And by the way, if we had that, we would also have stronger protections against what voter fraud there is.
And if I could just add, centralized election administration is very difficult. And so to the extent decentralized part of it adequately, the idea of having enough polling places is something that, again, both parties should want, because a well-functioning system will fight whatever voter fraud there might be. And obviously, I agree with Miles, it's a canard. But we don't want dead people to vote any more than anybody else does. We want a system that makes it as easy as possible for legitimate voters to vote. And unfortunately, if you're running a town or a city, it's not very exciting to voters to say, I gave more money to election administration as opposed to building a park in the neighborhood or giving more money to schools. And yet we've got to accept that having an election system that works and is well funded is well worth the relatively modest additional investment that we can make in it. And that's one of it may be the only book you'll ever read that has several pages on voter administration, because we take that really seriously.
That's fantastic. Let's see, we have one more. I'm going to ask one more audience question. Would this system end the Electoral College?
No, it would not. And I think we're, EJ and I have, this comes up often. We are not some 19th century elixir salesman that says, if you just buy our product, in this case, universal voting, all of the ills of democracy will be cured. It's not that way. So the Electoral College would not be affected by this proposal. The whole system of money in politics, which is an awful system that we have, where millionaires and billionaires are indeed having overwhelming, excessive influence in our politics. It wouldn't change the very undemocratic nature of the United States Senate, where 70% of the people elect 30% of the senators and 30% elect 70%. So, there are other things that need to be done. We certainly would support, it's not part of the book, but we certainly would support eliminating the Electoral College. It's a vestigial and a racist institution.
Could I just say the one impact of this system on the way campaigns are financed? Campaigns have to spend enormous sums of money to turn out their voters, also on voter protection at the polls, because people can stop others from voting. If you had this system, a lot of those costs would disappear, and they'd either reduce the cost of campaigns, or you could move a lot of that activity into persuasion and actually arguing about the issues facing the country. And that would be a much better use of the money, but also reducing the cost of campaigns would be a contribution toward having a better system of campaign finance, although we support a lot of reforms in that area, obviously, but that's not the purpose of this book.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. So I'm going to ask you one more question before we close. This has been such an exciting conversation, and I am product of many of these reforms in New York City. But in terms of with the midterms right around the corner and 2024 will be here no time at all, what is the one thing that you want our viewers to walk away with tonight? We can start with you, EJ.
I want people to imagine a democracy where everyone celebrates on election day. They may mourn the result of the election later in the night, but it would be a day when everybody knows that they and all their neighbors and people all over the country are turning out to make a consequential decision for their state or their city or their nation. I want people to come away with the idea that big reforms seem impossible until they become inevitable. We saw that, as I said earlier, with the secret ballot, which people didn't think was ever going to happen. We see reforms like early voting become a common practice as opposed to an idea that seemed impossible, again, at an earlier time. We're starting to see reforms like preferential voting, as they call it in Australia, the transferable vote or instant runoff, which the Australians have, be impossible and now are being adopted in state after state, and as New York did in its city primary. So we want people to think about a democracy that is inclusive, that is within our reach, and it wouldn't solve all our problems, but I think it would make a lot more people feel that the government represents them and they would feel that they had some real influence on the government.
Thank you so much. Miles, what's the one thing that you want our viewers to walk away with tonight?
Well, what I would really like people to go away with is that we have a two-part thing we have to do, and that is to work within the system that we have to get people to register and to get people to vote. But at the same time, I would really like people to walk away and help us to start this conversation. EJ and I are, with this book, are trying to start a conversation about a very, very different way of thinking about our elections. And if people will walk away and help us to begin that conversation, talk to people that you know, buy the book, talk to people about it. This is as EJ says, an idea that can start and generate more and more interest, and hopefully we'll get there.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Thank you to our audience for all your incredible questions. I wish we had more time to answer them all. Thank you so much to our partners, New York University's John Brenneman Center. Thank you, Miles Rapo and EJ Dionne, for this incredible piece of work and this conversation. I am closing out. I am Alexa Avilés, New York City Council member for District 38 and the Chair of Public Housing. And thank you for joining us in this incredible conversation about universal voting. Good night, everyone. Thank you for supporting the work of the Brennan Center for Justice. And with that, sadly, we must close, but we want to give you back 1 minute of the time today. This was so exciting and so much. We could talk so much longer about this, but please check out the book and let's have this conversation. Good night, everyone.